the three women who were murdered and a man who was shot and killed in North Hollywood last December. The victims and the suspects are all from Chicago. Police say all three are known Chicago gang members. Police won't say why the three suspects traveled all the way from Chicago to Los Angeles to commit the murder.
A lot of people just resort to violence. Like I say, it would be a shootout in Chicago over the smallest stuff. Chips, dice games, just the smallest stuff.
What's cracking, bro? I see you, bro. I don't mean no harm. I'm just not from around here. I got a big ass motherfucking gun. But I'm not from around here is what I'm saying. I'm from Chicago, bro.
Imagine living in a place where every 3 hours someone is shot, and every 14 hours someone is murdered. We're not talking about a war zone like Iraq or Afghanistan. We're talking about Chicago, one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in the world. But on the south side, gang violence has torn communities apart. The situation is so brutal that even the police and the gangs themselves agree it's like urban warfare spiraling out of control.
A lot of people just resort to violence. Like I say, it would be a shootout in Chicago over the smallest stuff. Chips, dice games, just the smallest stuff.
Like, to be honest with you, even standing out here right now is not safe. Period. None of these blocks and none of these streets are safe.
Take, for example, an incident that happened far from Chicago, but still reflects the mentality that grows out of that environment. On September 9th, 2023 in Pensacola, Florida, the Escambia County Sheriff's Office released a security video showing 32-year-old Rakeem Stephen Tate making what they called a bad decision turned worse. In the footage, Tate walks into a store, visibly armed with a gun tucked under his right arm. The store clerk, who had already spotted Tate's weapon before he even stepped inside, ran to the back to grab his personal firearm.
What's cracking, bro? I see you, bro. I don't mean no harm. I'm just not from around here. I got a big ass motherfucking gun. But I'm not from around here is what I'm saying. I'm from Chicago, bro.
Tate didn't end up robbing the place, but he was charged with openly carrying a prohibited weapon and attempted robbery. The sheriff's office posted the footage on Facebook with the caption, "Not a good time for a robbery," and threw in a jab saying, "You're not in Chicago anymore, you're under arrest." While law enforcement saw it as an attempted robbery, some people believe Tate wasn't there to steal, but was instead just paranoid, conditioned by the brutal streets of Chicago. It's not far-fetched to think he might have PTSD from living in a place where violence is a daily occurrence. The streets of Chicago can leave people constantly looking over their shoulder even when they're miles away from home. That's the thing about Chicago gangs. They don't let up and they don't forget. Even if an enemy runs to another city or state, these gangs will go to any lengths to find and finish their opposition. That's exactly what happened when 3 Chicago gang members murdered 4 of their rivals in Los Angeles. The victims and the suspects were all from Chicago, but the violence followed them across the country.
3 known Chicago gang members suspected in 4 murders in Southern California are finally captured. The investigation and arrests spanning across multiple states.
In January 2023, the bodies of 3 women were found in the Beverly Crest neighborhood of Los Angeles, not far from Beverly Hills. A man had also been killed just before Christmas in 2022. After following leads and gathering witness statements, the LAPD, working with the FBI and police departments in Chicago and New York, arrested the suspects 28-year-old Darius Stanford, 22-year-old Dante Williams, and 28-year-old Dejon Tompkins. 2 were arrested in Chicago and Indiana, while the third was caught in Manhattan.
The 3 women who were murdered and a man who was shot and killed in North Hollywood last December. The victims and the suspects are all from Chicago.
Stanford and Williams were charged with 3 counts of murder and 6 counts of attempted murder. Tompkins was also charged with 4 counts and linked to the December 2022 murder of Julian Bynum in North Hollywood. The 3 women who were killed, 29-year-old Nina Davis, 26-year-old Destiny Sims, and 33-year-old Yana Hutton, were not the gang's intended targets. According to the police, the women had rented an Airbnb to follow a Chicago-based rapper and were murdered right in front of the house they were staying in.
Police say all 3 are known Chicago gang members. Police won't say why the three suspects traveled all the way from Chicago to Los Angeles to commit the murder.
Although the police didn't give details on why these Chicago gang members traveled all the way to LA to commit these murders, fans speculated it's just another example of how ruthless Chicago gangs can be. Unlike gangs in California, which are often seen as chaotic and leaderless, Chicago gangs are known to be more structured and organized with a cold, calculated mindset. Melvin Farmer, an OG from the 8-Tray gangster Crips, shed some light on the big differences between the gang cultures in Los Angeles and Chicago. According to him, gangs like the Gangster Disciples, GDs, in Chicago operate under a completely different structure compared to the Crips and Bloods in LA. Farmer explained it's a different ballgame. They got a different structure than the Crips and Bloods. You gotta remember, GDs are growth and development. The Vice Lords too. They came up in the 60s, so they have a whole different mentality. They were passing out lunches and doing community stuff. It's a big difference between street gangs and gangs like the Gangster Disciples or the Black Panthers. They had structure, a chain of command. The streets, though, without that structure, they're like a hole without a pimp. They're renegades.
And they got a different structure than Crips and Bloods. You got to remember, GDs are growth developments, Vice Lords. They came up during the era of the 60s, so they got a whole different mentality. The Gangster Disciples, the Black Panthers, they had a structure, a chain of command, whereas the streets, just like a without a pimp, they renegades.
That level of organization doesn't just stop on the streets, it carries over into the prison system too. Sammy Horowitz, a Chicago native and former member of a predominantly Latino street gang, spent over 8 years behind bars, and he shared some insight into how gang politics work in prisons between California and Chicago. One of the most notable differences, according to him, is the role race plays. While racial divisions are a huge thing in California prisons, that's not the case in Illinois. He explained that doesn't exist in Illinois like it does in California. We used to hear about how things were out here, how everything was divided by race, but that's not really a thing in Illinois. I say Chicago because almost everyone who goes to Illinois prisons is from Chicago, with a few exceptions from southern Illinois or more rural areas. But yeah, most inmates are from Chicago. In Illinois, the politics in prison are more about what gang you're aligned with rather than what race you belong to. Horowitz explained it as being divided into two groups, folks and people. In Chicago, instead of just Bloods and Crips like out in California, you have folks and people. Think of them like umbrellas, and underneath each umbrella there are different mobs. You've got the Gangster Disciples and Black Disciples, which are under the folks umbrella. On the people side, you've got Vice Lords and Four Corner Hustlers. Then when it comes to the Latino gangs, you have Latin folks and Latin people too. On the people side, you've got Latin Kings, Latin Counts, and Saints. On the folks side, you've got gangs like the C-Notes, Maniacs, Spanish Cobras, and Insane Dragons.
I know out here, for example, there's like Bloods and Crips and everything like that. In Chicago, you have folks and people. You have like, look at them like umbrellas, right? And underneath those umbrellas, you got different mobs. African Americans, for example, you got Gangster Disciples, Black Disciples, that's folks. People, you'll have like Vice Lords, Four Corner Hustlers, that's people, and Latin people. So for example, Latin people also aligning with the five, you know, the people, you have like Latin Kings, Latin Counts.
He also pointed out that this gang structure flows into the prison system in Chicago. When you get to prison in Illinois, the first question you get asked is, what are you, or K2s, meaning what gang are you with? If you're not part of an organization, they call you a neutron, which basically means you're neutral. If you get to Cook County Jail or down to prison, they'll ask you who you align with, and you tell them whatever organization you're part of. They'll tell you where your guys are. In the county jail, it's more divided, but in prison, you'll just find your group and blend in. The structure of Chicago's gangs has always been highly organized, and that's exactly why they don't tolerate nonsense, especially when it comes to outside threats. Recently, Chicago's gangs have found themselves clashing with a new and unexpected rival, Venezuelan cartels. A notorious Venezuelan prison gang, Tren de Aragua, which started inside Venezuela's prison system, has now infiltrated the United States, and their presence has been raising red flags in cities like Chicago.
Criminal cases connected to suspected gang members.
America has allowed gangs to enter our country.
The migrants that are coming, they're taking over every block right now.
The city of Chicago is gonna go up in smoke, it's gonna go up in flames.
Tren de Aragua evolved from just a prison gang into a massive transnational criminal organization. With over 5,000 members, it's Venezuela's largest criminal group, involved in trafficking, drug smuggling, and human trafficking. This gang has been linked to some high-profile crimes across the US, including in cities like New York, Denver, and Chicago. The fact that they're popping up in sanctuary cities like Chicago has local law enforcement on edge. Emails obtained by News Nation from the Cook County Sheriff's Office showed that warnings about this gang's presence in the Chicago area started circulating as early as October last year. The Tren de Aragua is described as a new threat developing amongst the newly arriving immigrant community. With its deep roots in human in Latin America, the gang is suspected of bringing that same criminal activity to US soil, including and labor trafficking. In one email, officials at the sheriff's office admitted they had been discussing the possibility of a criminal network operating within Chicago's migrant community and preying on vulnerable new arrivals. One email bluntly stated, "It appears we have confirmation of that now. Chicago isn't the only city feeling the impact. Law enforcement agencies in New York City and Denver have also confirmed the gang's presence. However, the Chicago gangs are not sitting idly by when Tren de Aragua tries to make its mark." Muhammad, a 53-year-old former gang member who now leads a street patrol and violence prevention program called Ex-Cons for Community and Social Change, has spoken out about the situation. He says that seeing Venezuelan criminal gangs infiltrating local shelters and taking over apartment buildings is the final straw for Chicago's African-American community, which has long struggled with poverty and violence. Muhammad and many others in the community are furious about what they see as government money being funneled toward non-citizens. He said it's impossible to let gang members and criminals flood into our country through broken borders and drop them into our communities which are already struggling.
It is impossible to release gang members and criminals into our country through the borders and broken walls.
Speaking from the O Block, one of the most dangerous parts of the city, Muhammad warned, quote, "When the gangs here get fed up with the illegalities and criminal activities of these migrants, the city of Chicago is going to explode. And when the bloodshed hits the streets, there's nothing the National Guard or the government can do to stop it."
And the black gangs in Chicago get fed up with the illegalities and the criminal activity of these migrants, and there's gonna be nothing that the National Guard or our government can do about it when the bloodshed hit the streets. Blacks against migrants.
The numbers back up the frustration. Chicago has spent nearly $500 million over the past 2 years dealing with the influx of more than 42,000 migrants since 2022.
And they're all furious at the estimated $500 million that's reportedly been funneled toward new migrants in Chicago since 2022. Be either about what they say are Venezuelan criminal gangs that are leaving the shelters and spilling out into the South Side into abandoned buildings.
Some of them belong to Tren de Aragua, the once Venezuelan prison gang that's now operating as a multinational crime syndicate. Sources in Chicago have told reporters that members of this gang are heavily armed, brazen, and spilling into parts of the South Side, traditionally controlled by Chicago's deeply rooted gangs such as the Gangster Disciples, Black P. Stones, Vice Lords, Latin Kings, and Satan Disciples. You can even see Tren de Aragua members out on the streets, often wearing Chicago Bulls t-shirts and hats, flashing gang signs as they try to muscle in on local gangs' territories. One specific incident occurred near a 7-Eleven store close to the Standard Club migrant shelter downtown, where local Chicago police officers said the Venezuelan gang was attempting to take over a drug-dealing corner. Despite this, employees at the Standard Club deny that there's been any crime or Venezuelan gang presence at the shelter. But that doesn't align with what activists have found. Terry Newsom, a Chicago dad turned activist, teamed up with Muhammad and other concerned community members to dig deeper into what's really going on. Newsom found that there were 720 police incident reports filed at the Standard Club alone over the past year, contradicting claims that the area is free from crime. In an effort to expose the truth, Newsom and his team have been filing dozens of Freedom of Information Act FOIA requests, trying to get to the bottom of what's really happening with the migrant crime surge and the infiltration of Tren de Aragua. Terry Newsom, an activist, showed the Post police reports revealing disturbing criminal activities at downtown shelters, and we're talking about serious stuff: trafficking, drugs, carjackings, weapons, and spousal abuse. In one case, a TDA member was even released by a Chicago judge, despite Immigration and Customs Enforcement (ICE) requesting he be detained. Just a month later, that same gang member was charged in a violent jewelry store heist in Denver, not far from Aurora, Colorado, where TDA members have reportedly taken over entire apartment buildings. Things are getting even more intense on the streets of Chicago. Earlier this month, Chicago police responded to a call about 32 armed Venezuelans showing off their weapons in a building on the south side. It's no wonder the locals are fed up. Many residents, including the younger generation of gang members, who are sometimes called the millennials by older gangsters, feel completely overlooked by city officials. They're angry that resources are being handed to other communities while their own continue to suffer. David, a young Gangster Disciples member, vented his frustration to the Post, saying the real issue is that America's letting gangs that they would consider ex-terrorist groups into the country. He added angrily, "They're letting terrorist groups into our country," end quote. Zach Massey, a 27-year-old street leader who recently got out of prison after serving time since 2015, echoed the sentiment. He said, quote, "These migrant gangs are moving in on our territory and robbing people, but they don't get arrested like we do. I talked to one of them through a translator app and he told me how they're getting cars, apartments, EBT cards, all kinds of stuff. We barely get $400 a month and they don't even have social security numbers."
Talked to him on the translator app and he told me all the things that he got going on, how they help him get a car, apartment, clothes. I just be looking at it like they ain't got no social security number. Where they come from.
Corey Rogers, a Black P. Stone member, took a reporter on a drive around the area, pointing out locations where Venezuelan gangs had been, quote, "showing the flag," a phrase meaning they were brandishing their guns. He even showed a WhatsApp thread where gang members were threatening to start turf wars with the Venezuelan gangs. Rogers expressed his frustration with the lack of unity among the gangs, saying, quote, "What bothers me is that the Venezuelans are united. The black gangs are too divided and just taking each other down."
The migrants that are coming, they're taking over every block right now in this area. Right now, you don't see them because they come out at night.
Charles Harris, a gang leader and friend of Rogers, added his perspective. He pointed to areas of the Woodlawn neighborhood and explained how while the violence has calmed down somewhat, the last thing they need is Venezuelans stirring up more trouble. "It's still violent down here, but it's calmed down a lot compared to the old days. The last thing we need is the Venezuelans," Harris said. Muhammad, a former enforcer for the Gangster Disciples' notorious leader Larry Hoover, has even formed a group called Ex-Cons for Trump because he feels the Democrats have been, quote, "failing inner-city black communities for too long." "It's not really about Trump himself," Muhammad said, "but the Democrats are selling us out." He noted how some wealthier black people might support figures like Kamala Harris, but he doesn't see how she or others are doing anything for the struggling communities on Chicago's South Side. Others do not feel the same, though even Rev. Corey Brooks, a longtime pastor and community leader, feels the frustration. Brooks, who's been running his church and outreach group Project Hood on the infamous O Block for over 20 years, explained that his conservatism came from years of witnessing the, quote, "failed policies of Democratic leaders." He also highlighted how, despite being a Republican, he's genuinely concerned about the growing presence of Venezuelan gangs in his community.
Some of the values that the conservative Republican Party holds so dear. And so for a lot of people, it's not about the person, it's about the policies that we're fed up with.
Brooks shared a story of a young Venezuelan migrant who fled his apartment after realizing he was living with gang members. The young man, terrified for his life, spoke to the Post, but didn't want to give his name or appear on camera. Quote, "If they found out I was talking to anyone, they'd end my family's life with one bullet," he said in Spanish, clearly scared of the violent people he had gotten mixed up with.
He had to flee the building where he's being housed because a Venezuelan criminal gang took it over. He said if they knew he was talking, they'd end his family's life back in Venezuela with one bullet.
It's not just gang members like Muhammad or Rogers who are fed up, though. Regular folks are feeling neglected too. Octavia Mitchell, who tragically lost her son to gun violence in 2010 and her nephew in 2022, started the Heal Your Heart organization to help others dealing with loss. She's frustrated that while over 400 people have been murdered in Chicago so far in 2024, the city seems more focused on helping migrants than addressing black-on-black violence. Quote, "I can't even reach anyone at City Hall who cares," Mitchell said. "They care about the migrants, but they don't care about us, the people who have been here all our lives. We matter too." The growing tension between Chicago's gangs and the Venezuelan cartels could be a powder keg. People are already saying that if this continues unchecked, it could explode into a deadly conflict because Chicago's gangs don't play.